The day is August 25th, 1793. A mysterious disease is spreading across Philadelphia, which was then the capital city of the U.S. Businesses are shuttered, mortuaries are filling up, rich people are fleeing the city. Families were torn apart from this disease. Wives abandoned their husbands at the deathbeds, and parents threw out their children at the slightest cough. In 1793, sanitation was not on people's minds. There was no efficient sewage system. Factories were in the middle of the city, and the carcasses of dead animals would just be left laying in the streets to rot. They didn't know it, but an epidemic of yellow fever was about to hit. There was a doctor who recognized this disease, Benjamin Rush. He was one of the founding fathers. He signed the Declaration of Independence, was fiercely religious, and was unquestionably brilliant. Rush was a physician, a politician, and definitely a leader figure in Philadelphia. Luckily, he had seen this disease before during his training. Fever, headache, nausea, typical flu symptoms. But at its worst, your skin turns yellow, your vomit turns dark with blood, and your chance of survival was not good. Let's just say that today, if you get to the point where you're vomiting blood, then you can flip a coin to see if you'll survive or not. Back then, the odds were worse. Every day he would see more and more patients coming into his practice with these symptoms, and knew that an epidemic was coming, so he told people publicly. But the public thought he was crying wolf. Many denied the existence of the disease, even other leading physicians. His main critic, James Hutchinson, was among them, challenging Rush on his claims. Ironically, he died from the supposedly non-existent disease that September. We really haven't learned anything from history. So, August 25th, Rush and the College of Physicians meet to talk about the situation. Now keep in mind, it's 1793, so viruses hadn't been discovered yet. Their understanding of the disease was very limited. It was believed that the illness spread through miasma, or bad air, so they encouraged people to breathe through wet cloths soaked with vinegar. It was on this day that they collectively decided that they needed to take measures against the virus.
As you can probably imagine, the disease spread like wildfire throughout Philadelphia that summer. There was no denying its existence then. People kept fleeing the city or locking themselves in their homes, almost like they were in quarantine. Unfortunately, quite a few doctors fled the city too, and many others died from the disease. Eventually, there were allegedly only 3 doctors left in the city, one of them being Benjamin Rush, who had to see around 100 patients a day during the outbreak. The poor man was obviously in desperate need of help. It so happened that Rush's colleague, John Lining, who was a physician from Charleston, had supposedly observed that Black people were immune to this disease. So this gave Rush the idea to recruit Black people as volunteers. What could be more ideal than having frontline workers who were already immune to the disease? Rush immediately sought out to recruit Black people to the front lines. He was able to convince Richard Allen, a free Black and his fellow abolitionists from Philadelphia, to help him recruit Black frontline workers. Richard Allen was a leader to the Black community, so you can imagine that Black people would probably trust whatever he'd say. Plus, the city was offering rewards to volunteers. Some slaves were even promised their freedom from their help. This originally seemed like a great deal to Black people, and they willingly became the frontline workers. They buried bodies, sat bedside with the sick, and even learned some medical skills like bloodletting, Rush's preferred treatment for yellow fever. Eventually, 2/3 of all volunteers were Black, about 3,000 people. This was significant, considering that Black people were only a small subset of the city's population at the time. But as the Black community began working, optimism quickly faded. The working conditions were terrible, especially in the mortuaries. Piles of bodies were stacked in cramped warehouses, and volunteers had to prepare the bodies for mass burials. To make it worse, most of the Black volunteers didn't end up getting paid. There was this story of 2 white men who simply helped move one coffin at a mortuary and got paid $40 for it, which was a lot of money at the time. A Black man who had been working there all day long, doing the same task, got paid nothing. Black people worked the front lines throughout the whole summer and received nothing in return.
And then suddenly the disease seemed to disappear. By the end of October, around November, the city finally breathed a sigh of relief. For 100 days, the city had been plagued with this epidemic. At the time, they didn't know why and how it disappeared, but we later discovered that it was because the cold killed all the mosquitoes that spread the disease during the summer. Around 5,000 people, or 10% of the population, died. And it wasn't just members of the white population who passed away. Members of the black community suffered too. The same percentage of black individuals died. So even though Rush had originally told everyone that the black community was immune to yellow fever, they later found out that this was completely false. And you can imagine how Alan felt. He was one of the leaders of the black community. People looked up to him and respected him. And he initially told everyone we're all immune to this disease, and as sons and daughters of God will help the white population fight this disease. Remember, this was when Philadelphia was transitioning from slavery to freedom. Not everyone in Philadelphia was an abolitionist, and even if many of the African Americans were free, nearly all of them suffered the effects of both fervent racism and extreme poverty. Allen secretly said that he regretted his choice, but it gets even worse. After the epidemic, an Irish-American publisher and economist named Matthew Carey wrote a pamphlet called A Short Account of the Malignant Fever. He was one of the individuals who just fled the city when the yellow fever epidemic settled in, since he had the means to do so. He accused African Americans of extortion and theft from people they nursed during the epidemic. Of course, Allen was furious. The black community spent months nursing the sick for little to no pay. They dug graves and worked amongst the dead. And now the people they fought so hard to protect and nurse to health were accusing them of taking advantage of the situation. So Allen and another abolitionist, Absalom Jones, wrote their own pamphlet in response. This one was called Narrative. Together they wrote about the reality of what the black community suffered, the working conditions, the lack of pay, and most importantly the fact that the black community wasn't truly immune to yellow fever. The pair brought their own statistics to show everyone what really happened. Most people were grateful to the African American community. Carey wasn't there to see what really happened, but many others witnessed the black community's courage in fighting the epidemic firsthand. Even the city leaders were incredibly thankful for the efforts of the black community. In a time where racial tensions were only increasing amongst the black and white communities, the yellow fever epidemic served as a way to improve relations between the two groups. Despite how deadly the 1793 epidemic was, it was a step in the right direction for African Americans, for abolitionists, and finally for the end of slavery.